Você que tá ouvindo esse podcast, quer saber por que o Senac EAD é o melhor pra você?
Com certeza. Diga!
Além de ser reconhecido nacionalmente pela atuação em educação profissional de qualidade, o Senac EAD conta com mais de 400 cursos entre livres, técnicos, graduação, pós-graduação, extensão universitária e programa de aprendizagem e mais de 390 polos próprios em todo o país.
Ah, e não pode esquecer de falar que ainda por cima é nota máxima no MEC.
Tá vendo? Quer saber? Senac EAD. Acesse ead.senac.br e saiba mais.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and F1 is back after its summer hiatus and heading straight into a doubleheader at Zandvoort and Monza. But what are the big storylines for the second half of the year that we're looking forward to, and how might they play out? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to preview the 2024 run-in are Mark Hughes and Ben Anderson. Well, Mark, welcome back. Raring to go for the second half of the season?
Yeah, because it was all just building up nicely, and then it was interrupted by the summer break, wasn't it? The competitive picture. So yeah, we had this convergence that we've long been dreaming about was finally happening. It happened over the last 4 or 5 races, hasn't it? And then all of a sudden, just wait for a few weeks, and we continue after the break. And so yeah, it was sort of like a cliffhanger of a soap opera, wasn't it? And going to the break.
Are you on the edge of this cliffhanger, Ben?
Yeah, I think we all are, aren't we? Convergence has been the key thing. We so feared that 2024 was going to be just another 2023 Max Verstappen steamroller, and it was looking that way in the early races. And now, even though the championship seems, particularly on the driver's side, a bit far-fetched that anyone can challenge him, and he just seems to keep eking out, small additions to his points lead. Each individual race weekend now is, not complete unknown, but a genuine contest. You don't know who's going to nail it. You don't know if Red Bull are going to be on top of things. You don't know if McLaren are going to be ahead. Mercedes have come into the picture. It's only really Ferrari that have started to lag, and that's maybe the only predictable thing based on a historical narrative of Ferrari.
Exactly, that does have a habit of coming to pass. But what we're going to do on this podcast is we're each going to choose 3 topics and storylines that we're particularly looking forward to. So we'll rotate between everyone. So Mark, we'll start off with your first choice.
Yeah, the thing I'm most intrigued is what can McLaren do with this season? What are its chances of coming out with a championship? Really, I think realistically we're looking at the constructors' championship. There's an outside chance Lando could do enough to threaten Max's lead before the end of the season if things really, really went well. But I think a much more...
The wheels would have to fall off, wouldn't they? Red Bull's
exactly.
wheels would just have to completely come away.
I think, but if you look at the Constructors' Championship and you look at the average gain that McLaren has been making upon Red Bull's lead in that championship since Norris made that breakthrough victory with the updated car, if they just did that for the rest of the season, they would be pretty much level pegging by the time you got to the final round. Now, that's not to say that that trend will continue, but it might do, and it might even become enhanced. So it's not a given the how closely matched the 2 cars are, and how McLaren seem to have both cars firing on all cylinders rather than just one of the cars, as is the case at has been the case at Red Bull. So I think it's quite realistic to look at McLaren as a sort of evens contender to come out of this with a championship. Now, the possible complication, of course, is that with Mercedes coming on form the last few races, the Mercedes and McLaren start to take points off each other when Red Bull wins. So, it's not necessarily just going to continue on the same trend line, but I think it's quite realistic to see this Constructors' Championship, which is, of course, the most significant one as far as the teams are concerned, and I think it's quite conceivable that McLaren could be contending for that title.
I think that would be a huge deal for them, wouldn't it, Ben, in terms of if they can get that constructors, just as something of an interim step, isn't it? Get everything settled, break the championship drought, and then go for the double next year.
It would be unbelievable, because although McLaren were coming on strong at the end of last year and they were quite clearly Red Bull's nearest challenger, talked a good game over the winter, started the year a bit undercooked, and I was like, this is all good, but maybe they're running out of steam a bit, and then they've really kicked on to the point where they're genuinely challenging, able to win races. But to claim the Constructors' Championship, I mean, that would be ahead of schedule. I think you would. I know Perez has been kind of making it easier for them, and maybe still Red Bull need to do something about that situation. I guess they give themselves a few races, a couple of good Perez tracks to come as well, to see how that shakes out. It would be an unbelievable fairy tale result for McLaren to nick that championship, but I think Mark makes a really good point about Mercedes, the fact that they've genuinely come back into the picture rather than had one of these kind of stuttering false dawns. I think that they, rather than Perez, will be the ones taking too many points away. I just can't at the moment, unless McLaren make another big step like Miami, see them definitively having both cars taking points off of both of those teams at each Grand Prix. I feel like Merc will get in the way sometimes. The fact that, Verstappen started Spa with a grid penalty and still beat Norris, that's the kind of swing that you really don't need to go against you when your main rival is hamstrung in a race. And there are a few tracks where, Red Bull will probably expect to have a tough time, and would have anyway, even if the chasing pack hadn't closed up in the coming races. But there are still also probably more really good Red Bull tracks coming than there are bad ones. So it's not going to be easy for McLaren to do it, even if Perez continues to open the door for them.
Yeah, I think you can also make a case that they're very, very slender favourites for the constructors, given the two-driver thing. And of course, points could be taken off Red Bull by Mercedes and Ferrari as well. So, yeah, very, very interesting to see how it shakes out. It was so close before the break that it could go either way, which is fascinating. The main thing is that it stays live and is decided on the last lap of the last race. That's always the best thing. Ben, what's your first choice of topic for the year, for the second half of the year?
Yes, mine is to see some kind of development in this whole Red Bull car development / Max Verstappen's contentment situation, because that storyline really, it had an explosion kind of around Monaco time, didn't it? But there was perhaps not a huge surprise that Red Bull had a difficult weekend there, and it exposed some long-running problems. But then, of course, they've stayed under the cosh because of McLaren's improvement and then Mercedes' improvement. And then Hungary had that proper explosion where you had, tired, ranty Max having a bad weekend and just kind of railing against everything, and particularly Red Bull's kind of lack of progress. And it was unusual to see that team introduce, a quite substantial, certainly visually substantial update, and it not really move the dial. And we had obviously the Singapore anomaly, and that turned out to be an anomaly last year in the narrative of that season. But we're not really used to talking about Red Bull in terms of development missteps, or not really having a proper handle on how they push their car forward. And we've got that now. And so this second half of the season, kicking back off at Zandvoort, obviously big pressure weekend because it's another home race for Max, the home race for Max. They need to show that they've kind of used these 3 weeks on the beach to have thought through these problems and found a way forward, because they've, from being this kind of metronomic winning machine, they've become suddenly a bit erratic, and that's quite surprising.
Yeah, the interesting thing about that point, Bennett, I think, is that because they've had such an advantage in the previous couple of seasons, those to's and fro's in how well suited they are to a particular track layout or surface haven't impacted on the fact of that they were still dominant. It was just a question, were they dominant comfortably or dominant a little bit less comfortably, and that was as far as the swings went. But as soon as McLaren and Mercedes start getting within sniffing distance of the Red Bull, suddenly those swings of specific circuits become to matter competitively much more, and you suddenly see it. And Max pointed out when he had that really rough weekend in Monaco because the car just wasn't handling the curbs. He said, "This is not a new thing. It's been like this since 2022." He said, "But we used to have such a big advantage, it didn't matter. You wouldn't notice." He says, "But yeah, you suddenly were exposed." And I think that he was talking about a specific weak point there, but I think it carries in all of the problems when you get right down to when you really, really try and push and eke out the last few hundredths of a second. You've got that problem. You've got the problem of keeping the bouncing at bay. You've got the problem of getting the balance consistent between low speed and high speed corners, and these are generic problems with this generation of car. And I think the McLaren looks a little bit more flexible in how it handles those generic limitations. And so, yeah, the Red Bull still, I think, when everything's right and everything in its happy place, I think it's still the fastest car. But I think the McLaren is much more comfortably into its sweet spot, and I think it's a much more flexible performer. I'd be amazed if we go to any track, if the remaining tracks and the McLaren's slow. It's just not going to happen. The McLaren will be fast everywhere. The Red Bull, based on the last few races, think, I don't know. There are certain things can trip the Red Bull up. So maybe here, maybe there, it might be struggling a little. And it only has to struggle a little, and it's if McLaren and Mercedes are on form, suddenly you're looking at Max on the third row. So yeah, I think it's become more apparent what its strengths and weaknesses are generically, as Mercedes and McLaren in particular, have made so much progress this year.
I think exposed is a good word there, because there's a lot that potentially can unravel at Red Bull. There's been all the off-track stuff. There's still been people leaving. We find out soon what Adrian Newey's doing next, potentially. Obviously, Wheatley's off to Audi. Horner's kind of clinging on in charge. Obviously, everything that happens then affects what Max does next. There's the whole Mercedes thing. Toto still making overtures and keeping that seat open potentially for the future if it unravels too badly. But as a kind of sense check, Max could also look at, because we're talking about the Max Red Bull really. The Perez Red Bull is underachieving, so that's naturally more exposed by the gains that Mercedes have made, the gains McLaren have made, and the troubles that Red Bull have just run into with, asymptoting on the regulations and development and cost cap and, the aerodynamic testing restrictions, etc. But Max can look at the first half of the season and say, well, we were outpaced in Miami, where the McLaren was updated, but the race was a bit of a mess, and he might still have won that race if circumstances were different. There have been other races where it's been close, but he's been in the mix and either won or nearly won. And it's probably only the first stint of Silverstone and Monaco and Hungary as entire weekends where they've been off the pace. It's only two, you could argue it's only two outlier circuits out of the whole first half, or more than half, isn't it? Because we're not dead in the middle of 24, where they've had genuinely no answer. So you're also in a situation where you've got to be careful not to overreact, because the whole point of the Red Bull is that it's meant to be a car that works across the broadest range of circuits in order to be a championship car. And I think that's still the case, even though I completely agree that it does look peakier and harder to get working than the McLaren does. But I think it still has that smidge of extra outright pace in more places than McLaren does.
It's possible we might see that coming through, certainly relative to McLaren in the upcoming doubleheader at Zandvoort and Monza. The efficiency of the car will be great for Monza, and Zandvoort certainly isn't going to be the strongest McLaren track, or shouldn't be. Anyway, you never know with upgrades how these things might change things. The other positive for Red Bull is they did feel there's more to come from that bodywork package they had in Hungary on Verstappen's car, so there's perhaps more for them to extract from that. I'll go with my first pick now, and I'm going to just talk about the development war, and I mean that in terms of the context of the challenges of 25 and 26, because everybody will have had the 25 car in the wind tunnel for a while now. A lot of the developments that will come through are ones that will already have been signed off, etc. But there's still this challenge of balancing up your 24, 25 and 26 developments. Obviously, 24 developments is tapering off, but there might be teams who feel they've got things they can bring that directly lead on to 25. So we will still see some packages coming in the second half of the year. Williams have got a couple of fairly chunky packages coming, having done very, very little in terms of upgrades in the first part of the year, for example. And although
do you think anyone's going to do a McLaren 2012 to 2013 and just throw their car in the bin for the last year of the regs and go all out?
No, I think that would be lunacy, unfortunately. The main question would be whether, say, a Red Bull or someone like that feel like they should change their suspension significantly, something like that, or whether whether Ferrari rather make a suspension change. But basically, your ideal
What about an
plan,
Aston, who are having a kind of disappointing time?
They always talked about the 24 car being the basis for the 25 evolution as well. That's what everybody's trying to do. And the problem is that everyone will have the 25 car relatively well advanced, even at this stage, because of needing to front load it. Once you get to January, the 26 car can go into the wind tunnel and do the aero testing. They've already got project teams working on 26 for some time, because you can do all the other stuff. You just can't do the aerodynamic testing. So your absolute priority is to clear the decks as much as possible on aero testing in 26. And remember, this is aero testing limited by the ATR. So also the higher up the championship you are, the less you've got. So you want to basically minimise the 25 development that's being done in 26. And that's all being balanced up and decided here. And it's interesting when you've got a championship fight going on, whether teams are tempted just to, we'll just maybe see if we can just squeeze one more little floor tweak out of this, put the car back in the wind tunnel, which we weren't going to do. And the trouble is there's no way of not making the trade-off or the sacrifice somewhere. You've got a finite amount of aero testing. Wind tunnel is particularly restrictive. There's CFD items limitations as well. And if you think, well, we'll do a little bit more on 24 than we planned just to try and squeeze one more update out of it, which is decisions that are largely made by now, then that does detract from 25. And as a knock-on effect, it could detract from 26.
Do you think more teams then will develop deeper into 24? So second half of the season that we've become used to, and use it as effectively early development for 25? And how does that square with the cost cap? Because obviously you've got limits across all the seasons in terms of finitely what you can do. So you've got to balance up that challenge as well with the need to get ahead.
Well, anything you can do that's directly relevant for 25 or carries over, if you can get it on the car, then you will, because you've still budgeted for making parts through to the end of the season, etc. So that's not a big problem to do it. Basically, the rule of thumb is the more you can front load everything, I think, the better. That's the simple answer. Your dream thing, and it looked like Red Bull might be getting towards that earlier in the season, where they can cruise through 24, get the 25 development out of the way,
do the old Mercedes thing, basically.
Yeah, maximise 26. But I think if you're a Red Bull, you've got a bit more of a head scratcher of a situation going on, or even a McLaren, because you might look at it and think, well, actually, we could win a Constructors' Championship this year, we could be championship contenders next year. Who knows where we'll be in 26? So there's different teams in different scenarios. And
if you're Merck, you're going to be looking purely at 26, aren't you? Even though things are going well now, they're going to be much more focused surely on the
for the 26. Most part, yeah. But it'll all depend, won't it? Because you'll get to where you are with your 25 car and hopefully it's competitive enough. But if you get to the early races and you're struggling, there will be a natural push to divert a little bit more in terms of your resources. So we'll start to see that playing out in the final races. Normally, you might see a team bringing a few bits for Zandvoort, and then Singapore tends to be the point where there's sort of your last major upgrade. But then you do see upgrades turning up later in the season. I'm sure some will be doing that. So that'll be an interesting little storyline burbling along in the background. But yeah, it's very much not like the old days where you could kind of brute force it. You've got finite very finite resources as a top team, and decisions being made now, probably decisions that have been made, are already having a tangible effect on the 26 World Championship, which is the nature of the long lead times in F1. Well, before we carry on, you'll have heard us talk a lot about the Race Members Club on this podcast, and as well as being able to ask us questions, members will also get our bonus content, which includes my regular book club podcasts. Recently I interviewed Derek Warwick about his new book, which is excellent, and we've also got regular questions answered members podcasts. There's an exclusive Gerhard Berger members podcast coming up, as well as part of our Bring Back V10s members output as well, and that includes our 1997 Revisited series as well. So there's lots more, and to get a taste of it, you can now take out a 7-day free trial with us on Patreon for a limited time. See the link in the description for information on that.
Hello people, Joachim Walera here, host of the Athletic FC podcast. The new Premier League and European football seasons are here, and the Athletic FC has you covered. Join me, David Ornstein, Phil Hay, and the most stacked footballing newsroom ever assembled every Monday to Thursday, as we take a deep dive into the biggest football story of the day. Then every Friday, Adam Leventhal and our club reporters will preview the potential tactics, drama and jeopardy riding on the biggest game from that coming weekend. Check us out wherever you get your podcasts from for free. We hope you can join us for what is set to be another blockbuster season.
Let's move on to our second round of picks of the storylines we're watching out for in the second half of the year. Mark, what's your second choice?
I'm intrigued at the intra-team matchup at Mercedes, and looked for a lot of the season as if George Russell was dominating Lewis Hamilton, and Lewis even saying on TV, "I don't expect to be out qualifying George at any point this year," which was a startling thing to hear him say. But he's suddenly come alive, hasn't he? And he was fantastic at Silverstone. He was terrific at Spa, and he's right there. And of course, in combination with Russell's disqualification for being underweight, losing his victory in Spa, Lewis is actually marginally ahead in the championship, but more than the points, which never really interested me that much, to be honest. Is more interested in performance than some arbitrary points system. George is still very quick, and I think a lot of people forget that when writing off Lewis and assuming he's too old, that the comparison that they're making with Russell, as if Russell is just an ordinary driver. He's not. Russell is absolutely an elite potential world champion driver and has been ever since he came into Formula One. So you're not comparing him with Valtteri Bottas. With the utmost respect to Valtteri, he's a level higher than that. He's an absolute elite level driver. So the fact that all of a sudden Lewis seems to have got this spark as the car has been improved, and it's beginning to be able to drive it in the way he likes to drive it. Suddenly we're seeing a more level competition between the two drivers, and I think Lewis would love to end his final season at the team as the dominant one there, but I don't think it's going to be as easy as just deciding he wants to do it, because, as I say, Russell is a fantastic driver. As I remember when he was announced as the Mercedes driver, I remember Charles Leclerc, who'd obviously been his teammate in the junior series, saying, "Oh, now this is going to be interesting. George is a fantastic driver." So, I think people saying that Lewis is going to face an almighty challenge with Charles Leclerc, he's already faced an almighty challenge with George Russell. So I think two fantastic drivers competing in a car which is looking like it's finally found its feet. And I think this is going to be a fascinating dynamic, because Lewis doesn't have to worry about anything. He's out of there at the end of the season. Whereas for George, it's very, very important that Lewis doesn't get the bragging rights as he leaves, because then the the implication further down the line is could have career impact upon George.
It's great we're at least seeing a little bit of this Russell-Hamilton battle, which hasn't quite played out as we expected, has it, Ben? We're expecting them to be fighting for championships. That's not going to happen, but at least we might have this scrap between the two, if not necessarily resolved. At least we're going to get a little bit of it. It's
probably quite helpful for Mercedes that Hamilton's off a year earlier than they expected, because now the performance of the car and the two drivers are coalescing around that level of performance. It has the potential to get quite spicy, and I always felt like this. I think this is true of Piastri and Norris as well to an extent, but obviously Piastri is much earlier in his career trajectory, so it's slightly different dynamic. I always felt like the Mercedes pairing had the most combustibility in it if Mercedes got their act together and got the car capable of fighting for the championship. But I think we're going to miss that, because although it's starting to happen, they're not going to figure this year, and then Lewis is off. So all we're going to get is kind of gloves off Lewis trying to finish on a high versus, George the future, trying to keep what slender advantage he's built up. It's intriguing to me how Lewis has kind of clicked suddenly with it, because it did look like he was kind of a bit lost, and with this generation of car particularly, obviously doesn't quite get on with, this inherent behaviour, particularly at low speed. But he seems to have figured a few things out, and at least got back onto more of an even keel. And at the same time, Russell, everything Mark has said about him being an elite driver is true. But I'd started to question him a bit. We'd seen him make a few too many big mistakes, not really seem to have a handle on the tyre management element. We were asking on this podcast after Canada whether he was even the right choice to be Mercedes lead driver when Hamilton finally leaves, because of these questions. And then he's kind of emphatically answered them indirectly by, particularly Spa, being the one guy, okay, it didn't work out, on the legality side, but being the one guy to go off and do the unusual strategy and make the tyres last. That's something that we haven't really seen from Russell. That's more the drive you expect from Hamilton. So Russell's kind of ticking more and more of the boxes that Mercedes need him to tick to ensure that their kind of post-Hamilton future is right. And I imagine Lewis was probably quite pleased to see George disqualified from victory at Spa, because I think you Ed said that he was so furious that George was the one who picked up the victory in Austria. So there's definitely this kind of unspoken needle element where Lewis wants to go out as the guy who was on top, and it's not been clear cut in his favour so far, which is a testament to Russell and his quality. And what you're talking about there is just the nature of racing drivers, isn't it? They're very competitive. They want to be the ones who win whatever battle is there in front of them. What's your second choice of storyline, Ben? So my second choice is another Red Bull one. It's the whole Red Bull second car and second team driver saga, a story that just has been running for
years.
Well, yeah, it does. It feels like forever. It's definitely at least 18 months. I mean, I remember us, talking about Perez being, pretty much finished. Going into like Singapore 2022, his run was awful, and then obviously he won the race, and managed to turn things around for himself, and then repeated the pattern a bit last year, repeated the pattern again this year. There was this big clamour that he might be replaced after the summer. We might be looking at might be talking about a brand new, well, not brand new Red Bull driver lineup, but a different one. But another stay of execution, and now it's kind of pressure on, can he deliver up to Singapore? I think the talk is that Singapore is kind of another mini deadline in his kind of survival. That seems quite apt, because it's a place where he has gone well, even if Red Bull have struggled. So massive pressure on these next few races to see if he can kind of stem this McLaren tide in the Constructors' Championship. And then will Red Bull pull the trigger and promote Daniel Ricciardo? Will they change their mind about Yuki Tsunoda? Will they do something completely different? Will they go for Valtteri Bottas, Ed? If not for this year, for next year?
I don't think they're going to do that, but think about it.
Yeah, I mean, it would just be nice to see a resolution. We thought this was all done. They announced a new deal, possibly taking him into even 26, and now it all just seems to be unravelling again. I find the whole thing, the whole saga, frustrating and confusing as well. And it must be so unsettling for the team and the drivers. It doesn't seem conducive to, the kind of stability and focus you need to win what is, turning into quite an uncomfortably tight championship battle with McLaren for Red Bull.
It's astounding that a team of that quality that does so much right has let this be a sustained problem. I don't know about you, Mark, but I'm just fed up with them not resolving it. Either just say, right, we're sticking with Perez for the long term, or make a change. It just seems to be that they're hoping this problem solves itself as if by magic.
Yeah, and, historically we saw them promote junior drivers who found it very difficult to compete against a Verstappen at the height of his powers in a car with the traits that they had. So that knocked the confidence and prospects of Pierre Gasly and Alex Albon. And Perez was supposed to be the safe pair of hands that you knew would, because of his experience, would generate a certain level of performance. To an extent, he's done that. He's won Grand Prix, but in terms of raw performance, no, he's not the answer. But
they need more than that, don't they? They need more than a safe pair of hands now. It's a completely different.
It was okay when they had the car advantage. That level of performance from the driver would do the job. But if you said, okay, we've now got a car that's a competitive car. It's no longer the fastest, unquestionably, car. But it is competitive. Then a driver of Perez's standing is never going to be the job, because the other, given the lineup that's in the other two teams or the three teams.
He's the eighth best of the top eight, isn't he? Quite comfortably.
Yeah, comfortably. And I would have said that back in 2021. You said, right, of the contenders to put in that seat, if the Red Bull at someday is only merely competitive, who you put in, Perez would have been nowhere on that shortlist. He wouldn't have been. He has got strengths, and he is very good at certain things, and he did a fantastic job for Force India during a very difficult time for that team. But to try and imagine that just translates into being a Grand Prix winner on raw pace in a car that's no better than anybody else's, forget it. He's not that level of driver. Whereas all the others in those four teams are. So,
and Albon might have been if they'd stuck with him.
Now that Albon has the experience, and now that Gasly has the experience, you would say, I would be almost certain they would do a better job in that car now than Perez. So, not that we're about to find out, but
no,
it's
we're about to find out if maybe Daniel Ricciardo can light the fire again.
Yeah, but I think that's also the perennial problem, isn't it? There isn't if there was an obvious red hot prospect in the RB team, you'd say, right, do it, swap around. But there's not. There's question marks around Daniel as well. It is a bit of a mess. But I think this mess goes back to the original belief that Perez would be the answer. He was the answer when the car was dominant, but he was never the rock solid choice that would be needed just in case the car was not going to be dominant.
Well, he was meant to be an interim solution, wasn't he?
Yeah,
while they sorted the rest out, and they've wasted that opportunity. And do you know what? We get people saying, "Oh, you're just talking about the Perez future because you want something to talk about." But I find it incredibly tedious to constantly be talking about it because Red Bull can't sort it out, and they still haven't emphatically even sorted it out to the end of the season. If the rest of the team was run like this, they'd still be messing about at Jaguar level. It just astounds me they can be so. They should be in such a good position with 4 seats, and they're just not, and it frustrates me immensely.
I think it's caught them out as well, hasn't it? I'm sure that they, as we probably did, would have predicted a much easier ride through 24 and 25. We were talking, others in F1. Charles Leclerc was talking about 26. No one's going to get Red Bull before 26, and then all of a sudden we're here midway through 24, and Red Bull have been caught. They're Their dominance has completely slipped. And so therefore the Perez question, which they could keep legitimately punting down the road and getting away with, suddenly becomes, a quite significant problem for their Constructors' Championship hopes.
That's the thing in F1, isn't it? If you want to be at the top, you need to be answering questions before you absolutely have to.
Yeah, foresight.
So that's what I find so strange. Yeah, and I really do think this is a problem years in the making, not just 18 months or whatever. But yeah, it's going to continue to be a problem for a while. My second choice, I'm just going with whether Aston Martin can actually make some decent progress, because they've rather become stranded, haven't they, in that midfield after the great start to last season. This year,
they're the new Alpine.
Yeah, well, yeah, almost. It's been a little bit up and down, hasn't it? Obviously, they had the upgrade for Hungary, which did seem to yield some results. They've been struggling with porpoising problems prior to that. So kind of gently encouraging, but it's still only the fifth best car on its day, and they need to pull away from that. They need to be at least snapping at the heels of the big four. 26 now is the point where that team can realistically hope to take the great stride forward. But if they're going to do that, they need to make some big progress the second half of this year and next year. And that's why I want to see that from Aston Martin. Otherwise, it could be all a little bit stalling in terms of its progress. And ultimately, I don't know about you, Mark, but I'd like to see Fernando Alonso back up there, and even Lance Stroll in his day, mixing it in the top six.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the more up there, the better. And, the prospect of Aston winning races is an exciting one. But actually, I see their build-up in terms of the big signings they've been making at very senior levels. To me, that's got all the hallmarks of a massive build-up of forces for the new formula for 26. And, in the way that Mercedes did so before the hybrid formula. And they've even got two of the same key people there. So, yeah, I think if I'm looking at Aston's prospects, I think they're good, but not necessarily immediately. But I think for 26, they're an exciting prospect. And Fernando's just got to hope he can get one last glorious season of winning in, because his contract ends, I think, at the end of 26. And it's already been intimated.
What, his longest ever contract that he signed? Seems quite short for a longest ever contract, Fernando.
And I think his 26 prospects, from where we stand at the moment, I think are extremely good. But whether he continues into 27, aged 45, going into 46, yeah, it's pushing it a bit, I think.
Oh, he'd love to if he won the championship, though, wouldn't he? Carry that number one.
I think he'd that would be the fairy tale end. But I think you're right there, Mark, in terms of, I think of all of the teams, certainly those who are in the top sort of half of the grid on even an occasional basis, Aston Martin's the one that could most afford to say, right, we are all in on 26. We will maximise all of our aero testing for 26. And that means maybe giving up a little bit of potential in 25. But what I want to see them doing is showing their understanding the underlying science and able to make good, sensible steps within that, because then that shows that what they're doing with the 26 car will be in the right direction. So that's what I want to see starting to happen in the second half of this season. Right, let's pick our final choices now. Mark, your third pick for storylines for the second half of the year.
What on earth is going to happen with Alpine is my third choice. Because it just, if you'd said at the beginning of the season that partway through the season there would be yet another change of team principal and they would be stitching their own engine, potentially for the following season or the season after that, and be prepared to relinquish being a manufacturer and become a customer team of someone else's engine, it just defy belief. Regardless of how competitively poor the start of the season was, it just really defied belief. So the question is, what is the thinking behind those very senior management decisions? What is the thinking behind bringing Flavio Briatore on board? What is the thinking behind ditching Viri and becoming a customer team? Is it, as it looks from the outside, just to make the team a nice, clean prospect for sale to somebody else, somebody that wants to buy it? Or is this the sort of lean, mean, let's trim this to the margins and become really aggressive and become, an underdog, but with that real fighting spirit that we've seen that team be in the past? Like the way that Red Bull sort of became a force. Is it that? Is that the plan?
It's got to be the sale, hasn't it? Considering the history of that team before and it becoming Lotus and team Lopez and Oaks going in, and we know that High Tech were trying to get in under the FIA entry process. Yeah. I mean, effectively, it points towards that. That it's going to become a High Tech F1 team. You would imagine.
Well, you could say that everything when Christian Horner was brought in by Dietrich Mateschitz to run Red Bull. I mean, he had his own team as well, which did sort of run in parallel, didn't it, in the junior series?
That's true, yeah.
So, is it that? Is Briatore identified Ollie Oaks as the new Christian Horner and, young, aggressive team that with a vision? And I don't know. Who knows? But, I'm just looking for some more clues as to what's going to happen to this once great and recently very competitive. It was only a couple of years ago when they were a very competitive team. They were the best of the rest outside the top three. Yeah. So and comfortably clear of the others, and quicker than McLaren usually. But
squandered it, haven't they?
Yeah. How has this happened so quickly? But also, what is the plan? And I'm looking for some pointers in the remainder of this season to see if we can sort of read between the signs and work out what the plan is. And because it's a shame because there's some really, really good, gifted people there and some hard-working people, and there's been an awful lot of money thrown into that project over the years, and it's just a potentially great fighting little unit, but is justice going to be done to that? Are the circumstances going to be put in place where that can become apparent?
I think the problem is that fundamentally, under this ownership, they've lost the right to have the benefit of the doubt. Let's put it that way, because of how little ultimately has been achieved. So it would be great to be proved wrong, wouldn't it? Because it does look like it's being set up for a sale, but maybe there is some other plan going on. But until we actually see firm, tangible evidence of that materialising, it becomes very difficult to take the team seriously. But like you say, great people there. It's got a great history, so you want to see it fulfilling its potential.
And you can make a legitimate, pragmatic argument for the engine switch, even though ditching your own expensive engine programme robs your potential. You don't think the Merc engine is a fundamental upgrade on the Renault engine?
It's a fundamental upgrade on the Renault engine, but you
can make that argument, can't you?
No. Your first option, that's like taking here's a path that'll be okay. In Formula One, you succeed by doing everything to the absolute maximum. Your own engine is the best possible thing you can do. If you've got an underperforming engine,
not if you do it badly.
No, but that's the thing. You go into it, you say, right, we will sort this out. We will make this the best engine facility in Formula One. Whatever it takes, we will make that happen. Those were decisions that Mercedes made that laid the foundations for their success. Those were the decisions Red Bull made. As far as I'm concerned, deliberately scaling back, unless you're absolutely forced to for financial reasons, is an act of, we'll say okay is good enough. And that might actually mean that a team that's doomed to forever just flounder around as a works team, not getting anywhere, will do a bit better. But in doing so, they're conceding defeat. They're saying, do you know what? We're not good enough to make this close to ideal setup work.
It's planning for failure, isn't it? It's saying, we know we're going to fail if we continue to try to do well. So let's make it easier for ourselves. Unless you accept the premise that that's not what they're trying to do at all. What they're trying to do is get the team in
shed the unsellable bit.
Yes, exactly.
But the thing is, Ben, I accept the argument you're coming from a different perspective is, yes, it probably will mean shorter term, better potential. So you could say, well, the perfect can't be the enemy of the good. But this if you're making that step, as far as I'm concerned, you've no business in Formula One. That is not how you thrive in Formula One. Every team that's been successful has pushed everything to the maximum, not said, oh, we're a bit useless at doing this properly. Let's do something slightly less good, a bit better, and get better results. It's just not right.
Well, they've got the midfield mindset, haven't they? That's what they're doing. But that's what the team is now, I think. So, I agree. I'm just playing devil's advocate, I suppose. But I do agree that it logically, all the pieces logically point more to how do we get out of this? How do we offload this thing that we just can't make work? Because the alternative is to plough more into it, isn't it? Is to invest properly in the facilities that people do extra, especially with 26 coming up. But that's the confusing thing, like 26 was a target, and they were ploughing resources into that. As a works engine team, one of the few, they had a chance to properly steal a march there if they could do it properly. And it's a strange time to have backed out of that entirely, as seems to be the case.
Well, one thing that's for sure is they will be doing things for a reason. No matter what you say about Fabio Briatore, he does have a method and what he's trying to achieve, but it feels like it's setting it up for a sale. Perhaps we're wrong. Let's see how things play out, and I'm sure we'll have some stories in the second half of this year. Ben, what's your final pick?
Yeah, my final pick is Ferrari, and whether they can finally get on top of this porpoising problem that seems to have undone them, to us unexpectedly, but not to Carlos Sainz unexpectedly, because the start of the season they were clearly second best. We were getting reasonably excited about Ferrari's trajectory. We were thinking, what foresight Lewis Hamilton had showed by rejecting the second year of his Merc contract to get into Ferrari, given the trajectories of those two teams. And now it's completely inverted, and Mercedes seem to be the place to be if you're Lewis Hamilton, and Ferrari seem the place not to be. But they very clearly identified this porpoising problem at high speed, under high lateral load, present at the Spanish Grand Prix after that upgrade, and identified as a reason that upgrade package didn't deliver the step they wanted in terms of pace. And they've been battling it since, and supposedly they have things in the pipe, as Fred Vasseur would say, to right that, and then hopefully we see the real Ferrari in the second half of the season. If not, then there's potentially big problems there that need to be addressed before Lewis makes his way to Maranello.
Yeah, I think it's a big question for next year, isn't it, Mark? Because that porpoising problem could be quite easily solved and tidied up, or it could be something a little bit more deep-rooted and they have had to roll more steps back. So it feels like it's a trajectory that could go a very good way or a very bad way over the coming races.
Yeah, and they've always been a bit of an outlier in terms of the top teams in the way that their car performs. Its strengths and weaknesses have always been very distinct. And this one's, it's like a revisit of 2022 almost, when nearly everyone was in this boat. The cars are constantly on the verge of doing it. That's the fastest way to run them. But all of a sudden, it's not able to run at a right height that it could previously. And there's something fundamentally not being understood there to end up in that situation. Is there a fundamental limitation in the suspension? I remember talking pre-season about something that the then technical director Enrico Cardile had said, where he'd said, "I think suspension's overrated. It's only important if it's bad." And basically, you just do a good, competent suspension that does all the things you want the suspension to do aerodynamically, and then that's it. You can forget about it. The rest is aerodynamics. And
he's going to clash with Newey if Newey ends up there, isn't he?
Yeah, then that seems counter to everything that, like, as you say, people like Newey have said, and people at Mercedes. So, it may just be that was Enrico's way of explaining something in his second language, but maybe there is something fundamental within the car that is limiting it at the moment, and that it's a deeper rooted, longer term research program to get out of that hole, rather than just an aero tweak in a quickly redesigned flaw that gets it out of that awkward point. But interesting to see how that develops in the remainder of the season too.
Big question for them, isn't it? And they're quite similar to the Red Bull one. Ed, you wrote about this idea that Red Bull might need to fundamentally revisit their concept to try and buy some more wriggle room over the next, certainly in 25. And if Mark's theory on Ferrari is right, they've got not the similar outcome, but a similar fundamental problem maybe to address before the regs change completely.
Perhaps a more fundamental one, and they might want to use this car and what comes next year as a proper test bed to solve it, because it's still going to be a concern come 26. So yeah, Ferrari, it really, really could go either way, which is why that's such an interesting storyline. I'll pick my final one now, which is the possibility of a Williams revival. Now, they've had a pretty tough first half of the season. We've talked endlessly about the problems of the car being overweight, the crashes they had, all the changes they made with their approach, meaning the car was behind, and all sorts of problems. And we should see after the break the start of them showing some of the fruit that's born from some of the changes they've made, insofar as they had very few upgrades in the first part of the season. No floor upgrades of any aerodynamic nature. They had a floor change, I think, at Imola maybe, that was just about changing the laminate on it, about knocking some weight off the car. So they've got this big backlog of aero updates. Obviously, all the design and aero work's been going on, and they'll have upgrades for, the intention was before the break to have them for Zandvoort and then either Baku or Singapore, some pretty big steps. And there'll be some further weight reduction in that. They expect to be on the weight limit by the end of the season. So we might start to see a decent step from Williams.
How far off are they?
Well, enough that if they, still their weight disadvantage is a few tenths. They were talking about 4.5 tenths earlier in the season. They've shaved a bit off up to the break, but not much. So straight away, that's a pretty substantial amount of lap time without even adding.
Well, they're not
performance.
Horrendous anyway.
Yeah,
are they?
so I think it's not impossible that could turn it into a car that's capable of making Q3, because it's a very Q2-y kind of car.
Yeah.
So I'm interested to see what step is actually made there. So it's all the usual questions of, do the parts correlate? Are they going to work as they want them to? Have they found enough aerodynamic improvement? Are they going to hit up against any of these problems with porpoising or whatever? But I think this is kind of the point where on track we'll start to see some of the James Vowles Williams revolution really taking effect, and some of those changes they made over the winter paying them back, because obviously they made their chassis 14 kilos lighter this year, but everything else on the car is massively overweight, which is why they were net overweight. So there have been hidden improvements, and it won't take much to tip them from Q2 fodder to a nice Q3 threat and a regular, potentially midfield front runner. So that's what I'm interested to see. It's not going to be suddenly finishing on the podium or anything, but I think we'll start to see on track the Williams team that convinced Carlos Sainz to join and convinced Alex Albon to re-sign. How about you, Mark? Are you encouraged by Williams?
Yeah, I am. I think if you look, they're in that part of the grid where just a small improvement would bump them up massively in terms of the places. They're only, I'm just looking at the averages here, they're only 8 tenths off Red Bull in qualifying as an average. Then I think with some of the circuits we've got coming up, and with the team now hopefully firing on all cylinders and having got the weight sorted out, and the crash damage all sort of worked its way through the system, I don't see any reason at all why they shouldn't be punching a bit further up the grid than we've seen them in the first half.
And one positive thing is, although they had those problems early on, Dave Robson spoke before the break, and he said that actually where they are now is about right in terms of what he called the attrition budget. So although they had those series of crashes that were problematic, actually they then had a pretty clean run. So it's all kind of averaged out. And all teams' budget for this, attrition budget as he called it, So that's just parts wear and things you smash into things. Yeah, so a big
crash budget,
crash contingency. So they're not massively hamstrung when it comes to that. And they said that everything they're throwing on the car with these major upgrades should directly apply to 25. And the 25 car's been in the wind tunnel for quite some time for them as well. And they're doing 26 work as well. So yeah, it's an interesting time for Williams, and we might start to see that gentle, well, actually, a more an upward step I'd hope to see in the races after the break, and then they can pick up that gentle curve and hopefully convince the world that Carlos Sainz isn't mad to have signed for a team that struggled for so long. So that's a fun subplot. But there's going to be loads of other storylines. We've talked about 9 of them. We wouldn't have foretold half of the storylines that have arisen in the first part of the year. So the final 10 races of this year, I think, are going to be really, really fantastic. There's that tantalising hope of at least a Constructors' Championship fight, all these other things going on in the background about 25 and 26, and some really, really good matchups in teams and team to team, driver to driver. I think this is going to be a really, really good second half of the year. So thanks very much, Ben and Mark, for joining me to look ahead to that. We're now going to be packing our bags and heading off to the Dutch Grand Prix, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.